Today on Bonesaw's Garage, we're leveling out a Jeep. So, with Jeeps, we always want to put bigger tires on them, and bigger tires means you need more suspension. Well, with the Jeep JK, which is about 2007 to 2017, it's actually very easy to do. They have pretty generous wheel wells, but if you're on stock suspension with 35s, you're gonna rub. So there's a couple options. Obviously a lift kit, but those are expensive. So what's an option that'll work, especially if you stay the road most of the time, but you want the look of the bigger tires? That's where a leveling kit comes into play. So this is your basic leveling kit for a Jeep JK. So you got your rear spacer, and that will help align the coil into the bucket. And then you got your front spacers. Now there's 2 per side. And you can see if you double stack them, they lock into each other and give you a little bit more lift. And then extended sway bar links for the front. Now we're going to talk about why there's 2 pucks per side for the front. So this is the Jeep that we're leveling today. And if you could look at it, it's kind of hard to tell, but there's a slight rake to it. So the front end sits a little bit lower than the back end. That rake is so if you add weight or a trailer, it will sit level. It's very common on trucks. On Jeeps, it's not as needed. So if you want to maintain that rake, you only put one of the pucks in. But since we're going to go for a full level, we'll put both pucks in. Here's the front measurement at about 36.5 inches. Okay, so we have the Jeep jacked up, and let's kind of go over what all you have to disconnect. So obviously you're gonna have to disconnect the sway bar links because we have new longer ones. Also, that will help everything droop down a little bit more. And then you're disconnect the shock, and that should allow everything to drop. I have found that with these leveling kits, even some lift kits, you might have to loosen the control arm bolts just to allow that to swing a little bit more. Now, note on that, if you're gonna loosen the control arm bolts, generally don't loosen them from the axle side, loosen them from the frame side. And when you loosen them from the frame side, do not tighten them back up until the weight of the vehicle is back on the ground. That way you don't start pinching it when it's at full droop, and then when you compress it, it'll bind the bushing. So let's start working on disconnecting that and allowing the axle drop. Now with the leveling kit, it's gonna go right up here. These pucks are gonna go between the spring bucket and the spring. So you'll use your original spring, which is nice. You'll retain your factory ride quality. And then the big thing is make sure there is a rubber isolator up in here, and that will help prevent noise and anything like that. And by putting that puck there, you're basically moving the spring away from the spring bucket, and that's what gives you your lift or your level. Alrighty, so you can see this comes in the kit. This is the new front sway bar end link, and you can see that it's a decent amount longer than the original stock one. And this is just to keep your sway bar in a good range of motion without drooping down too low. So these will come in the kit, and put those in. And like I said, it's just a little bit longer, but those I generally put in last on the front. And we'll get back to the front and see where we're at. Okay, so got the sway bar end links off. I got the shocks disconnected. Like I said, a lot of times that's all you need to do. The big thing is you just need to drop down so the spring comes loose and you have enough room to get the new puck up in there. So lower this axle down some more. See if I can get enough out of it. So the spring is loose, and I'll push down on that a little bit more, see if I can get the new pucks in there. This is that rubber isolator I was talking about. You want to make sure that you utilize that. And I put that on top of the plastic, and there is an indexing part that goes with the spring. Also, if you shove this up there with the plastic in there and the isolator on there, it will help capture this on this metal part. Yeah, so it kind of captures it there. That way I can manipulate the spring up into the pocket. And you'll have small end of the spring that goes up, and then a big end of the spring. The big end of the spring on the end here is part of the pigtail, what they call it. There's a notch down here on the axle pad, which I'll show you that indexes into. So if you look right here, you can see that there's a groove and then a stop. That end of the spring will come into here and go into that stop. And that helps capture it, keep the spring from rotating, and just hold it right where it needs to be. And we'll hold your factory geometry for your caster and all that stuff. Okay, so here is why I said I put the sway bar end links on last. So it's good to be able to move this sway bar out of the way, especially when you're popping the springs in and out. And then also, you know, a sway bar is designed, it's a spring. So if it's misaligned or anything, trying to fight against the spring is a pain. So I put that one in, camera will focus, I put it in real loosely, I don't tighten it up. And then I get the other one, and again, put it in loose, so I have some room to move it. Because if you tighten down one side and this is misaligned, trying to get the lower end lined up with the pocket can be very difficult, whereas if you leave it loose, there's enough room in those threads and the bolt angles to kind of get it where it is, because you can see it's not perfectly lined up now. You know, it needs to almost go up an inch, but I can move that a lot easier with the slop that's in the bolts compared to fighting the entire spring. And afterwards, we're at about 39. All right, with the front done, we've moved on to the back. As you can see, it's pretty much rinse and repeat. Disconnect the shocks and then disconnect the sway bar end link right in there. And then we'll lower the jack and the springs will pretty much fall out. Let's see if we can do this somewhat slowly and carefully. All right. Okay, so springs are still in there. All right, so it's going back together. But to get the full droop, to be able to get the springs to drop out, I did have to remove this bolt for the brake line. And there's enough flex that'll cause it to be able to come down. If not, it'll stretch that line. And then there's one other spot I'll show you up underneath the Jeep. All right, so this right here is a bracket that helps support the e-brake lines. And there's just two studs up there and then two nuts that hold that wire bracket on. You have to take those off, and again, that'll give you enough flex on this for the axle to drop down, those springs to come out. So there it is, all done. See the Jeep? It's just a little bit taller. Not a huge difference, especially if you're running stock fenders with 35s on a JK, it's gonna give you more clearance. Now there is a note to this, and that is, even though you've got extra clearance, if you're going off-road and you're really flexing out the suspension, those 35s are still gonna get into those factory fenders. Now, if you go with a high clearance fender or a tube fender, that's gonna give you a little bit more, or you can go the route of just removing the inner liner from the fender and putting in metal inner liners. That will give you more room. If you're gonna do that and still run the stock fender flares, just know that that inner fender on those, it actually is part of the structure for the outer fender. So they're gonna get a little soft and they might move around in the wind. But it's something that you can do if you still like to retain the factory look of the Jeep with those fenders, because I actually do think they don't look too bad on the Jeep JKs. So as you can see, there wasn't a ton that I had to do to that. Like I said, unbolting the sway bar end links, the shocks, dropping that down on the rear. You had to take out a couple extra bolts for the brake lines and the e-brake cables. But all in all, not too bad. I did it in an afternoon with basic hand tools. A 10 millimeter, a 19 millimeter, and an 18 millimeter were the main tools that I used for all the suspension components, and then a 19 for the wheel lugs. So it's something that you can do. You don't have to get an alignment afterwards. You can still use your stock shocks, and you maintain that factory ride quality, because another downside to lifts, unless you're getting a high-end lift, is a lot of times they increase the spring rate for that lift. You're gonna get a rougher ride. So it's something to think about. But that's it for today. Until next time, go make something for your car. The before and the after.